Hi everyone and welcome to Protocol 36, and in today's video we'll be speculating how the upcoming animated Disney Plus show Spider-Man Freshman Year will handle Spider-Man's origin story in the MCU. Now we'll be looking at the different types of ways they could retell the classic story, as well as how different it will be from Tobey's and Andrew's origin stories from their respective first Spider-Man films, how many episodes they will make, also how it would still make sense in the greater MCU while not contradicting the Home trilogy or his appearances in other MCU projects. Also, this video will definitely contain spoilers for Spider-Man No Way Home, so if you haven't seen the film yet, please do so and then come back to the video. But if you have at any point you enjoyed this video, I really appreciate if you could drop a like, as that would really help out the channel. Thank you. Okay, so before we get into things they could do in Spider-Man Freshman Year to tell Peter Parker's origin story, we kind of do have to look at MCU Peter's origin story in Captain America Civil War, where until that point he has been using his homemade suit ever since he first became Spider-Man in the MCU, and of course massive mechanical web shooters, which were also made along with the web fluid, most likely using mid-and-highest chemicals to make them, like we saw in Spider-Man Homecoming. Also, nobody Peter knew personally knows Peter Parker is Spider-Man during that point. The characters like Aunt May, Ned Leeds and Michelle Jones don't know Peter is Spider-Man, because the show would of course take place months before Spider-Man Homecoming, with the exception of Tony Stark, possibly Nick Fury and other Avengers. Point would have been known because of videos on YouTube, and that he was only Spider-Man for 6 months during the events of Captain America Civil War, as he told Tony. So with those details out of the way, let's see the direction they could go when it comes to MCU Spider-Man's origin story. So I think it's safe to say that this show will finally introduce Uncle Ben, the type of character he is, and the relationship he had with MCU Peter, as well as Aunt May. It's also pretty obvious that they will use the series to show how he died in the MCU, and I believe they will take inspiration from the Ultimate Comics, where that series took around 4 issues to tell Peter's origin story in that universe. And even though it hasn't been confirmed yet, I do believe that the show so far will have 6 episodes, but that's just a theory right now. However, before we get into how he will die, we have to discuss where the spider that bit MCU Peter came from. Now we know that Oscorp doesn't exist in the MCU, at least not yet as far as we know. Things could change in the future, but in terms of the spider that bit Peter, where exactly did it come from? Well, we might have an answer from the comics, mainly in the 616 universe, where Peter was never bitten by a genetically modified spider from Oscorp, but instead a spider that was exposed to radiation during a test in a public science exhibition, where Peter just attended by himself thanks to his interest in science, which ultimately bit him, thus becoming Spider-Man. And in the MCU, I think they will definitely go into that direction for MCU Peter Parker, because not only is the comic accurate from Amazing Fantasy 15, his first comic appearance, but also very different from both Andrew's and Tobey's versions, where Tobey was bitten by a genetically altered spider at Columbia University during a field trip in Spider-Man 1, and the same happened with Andrew, but the spider was from Oscorp created by his father. So having MCU Peter get his powers exactly like he did in the comics would be perfect, especially when it was said that the show would have a journey unlike we've seen before, and a style that celebrates the character's early comic book roots, most likely using an animation style inspired by Steve Ditko's artwork, which would be fantastic, like we saw in that picture of MCU Peter Parker wearing glasses and similar type of clothes to Ditko's Peter Parker. So I definitely think at least a good portion of episode 1 will be seen wearing the glasses, especially before the spider bite, like Peter Parker did in his high school days for a bit. And of course take a look into his life before he was Spider-Man, which then he would get bitten by the end of episode 1. And once he gets bitten, I think it will be one of those cases where Peter will start feeling ill and will try to go home in episode 2. And then the next day he figures out that he has spider powers, kinda similar to Tobey, but instead of ripping it off, they may pay an homage to that movie, which makes sense since I do believe they will pay respects and nods to both Tobey and Andrew's Spider-Man, especially their first respective films, even though they're doing their own thing when it comes to the origin story. I also think it's safe to say that we'll be seeing Flash Thompson in the show, and I don't think we'll see MCU Peter fight his version of Flash, since as we saw in both Homecoming and Far From Home, he was still bullying Peter. But we're definitely going to see Peter discover his powers, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's very similar to how he discovers it in Amazing Fantasy 15, where he almost gets hit by a car and jumps and clings onto a nearby building, also discovering his strength by crushing a metal pipe. We saw similar things in both the 90s Spider-Man anime series and Spectacular Spider-Man, which had both versions discover their powers just like 616 Spider-Man did. And sometime afterwards we'll see him make his web fluid and of course web shooters, as well as his homemade suit. I wouldn't be surprised if Peter goes through different types of homemade suits, or at first uses static lenses but also realizes that he has a spider sense and instead uses emotive lenses, which as he explained to Tony in Civil War, that ever since he was bitten by the spider, his senses has been dialed to 11, so the lenses help him focus, which is also shown in No Way Home during the amazing apartment scene where he has to close his eyes to focus on where the danger is coming from, because his spider sense is constantly warning him that there's danger nearby. Now in terms of Uncle Ben and Aunt May, I'm gonna have Uncle Ben say the iconic line of "with great power there must also come great responsibility" in the show, because even though it's an Aunt May moment in No Way Home, it served as a reminder for Peter to keep doing the right thing, and it's definitely possible that her and Ben both share that together, over, which would explain when he said "I know" to May after she said it. Not to mention there was a moment when both Toby and Andrew were telling Tom's Peter how much pain they were also going through in order to comfort him. They talk about how Uncle Ben said that line to them, which we saw in their films. And Tom's Spider-Man has this specific reaction. Could be wrong, but it is a moment most people missed, and it's not confusion or anything like that. And at least to me kinda suggests that Ben also said that to him, or at least tried to teach MCU Peter a similar type of lesson before he died. Kinda like in the Amazing Spider-Man film, which was a moment borrowed from the Ultimate Comics. But of course, in that moment, Peter would not understand and would try to use his powers to make a bit of money. This is the massive change I think they would make, where I believe instead of having Peter take part in wrestling, like in Spider-Man 1, and a little bit in the comics, instead I believe they will have Peter appear in a very popular internet show on YouTube, which would be an adaptation of when Peter was hired by a producer to go into show business. But instead of television, it would be on YouTube, since that's where Spider-Man was mostly known, and nothing else, as shown in both Civil War and Homecoming, going on a very popular YouTube channel where he will show the public and the host of the video what he can do with his powers, which would allow him to get more attention and of course make more money. However, instead of getting paid for the money he was owed, Tom's Peter would get annoyed and talk about how unfair it is that he got ripped off. So when the fateful moment where a thief goes to rob the main host, Peter would of course not do anything and let him go, because he didn't get anything as promised, which would be the ending of episode 5. And then episode 6, the final episode, several days has passed, we see Peter go back home after meeting with Ned and sees a bunch of police cars outside of the Parker apartment, where he goes to find out what happened. And an officer tells him that his Uncle Ben has been killed by a mugger who broke into the apartment. May's with the authorities, making sure that she was safe after her husband was killed in her home, and Peter goes to check in with her. But once he overhears the location of where the killer might be, a Peter Parker filled with rage goes in to find the man responsible for his uncle's death. Donning their homemade suit, he goes to an abandoned warehouse where the killer goes to hide, and where Peter also finds him. He attacks him, webbing him up, throwing him across the room, and has him by the throat, but sees his face and recognizes him as the guy he let go a few days ago. His rage turns to guilt and sadness. Ultimately realizes that the killer wasn't responsible for Ben's death. Peter was, recognizing that he had the power to do something, but didn't, leading to the bad thing that happened to be Uncle Ben's death. He webs out the mugger for the police to find, and ultimately knows what to do with his great power. Peter was already a fan of the Avengers, especially Iron Man since he was a boy, and now looks up to him even more, not only as a genius, but also someone who uses that great power responsibly. Kinda like how Peter saw Captain America as an embodiment of that line in the comics. In terms of the villains that could or should show up in Spider-Man freshman year, I do have a video planned for that in the future, so if you guys want to see it, let me know in the comments below. But I think the ending of the show should overlap with that scene in Captain America Civil War where Tony and Peter finally meet. So yeah, as of right now, this is how I think the show will go. I wouldn't be surprised if everything in this video doesn't age well, especially after the trailer comes out, but at least has fun and try to be realistic in terms of how it could happen in the MCU. However, what about you guys? How do you think Spider-Man freshman year will handle Spider-Man's origin story in the MCU? Let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. If you enjoyed this video, please like, and one more subscribe. To begin, Protocol 36.